Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Immigration and Diversity Politics, a challenge to liberal democracy. I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Academy of Ideas, and the Academy of Ideas is one of the co-supporters of this event, along with Unheard, a new online publication which has been a wonderful addition to the public square, so do check that out. And the organisers would like to thank Unheard and also Jim Walsh and staff here at Conway Hall for allowing this venue to be used for the event. This event has been put together largely by two academics, Eric and Matthew, who I'll formally introduce in a moment, who have new books out on issues related very much to the theme of this evening's discussion, and they are invaluable additions to the conversation on what are difficult topics. So it's really good that they've organised this evening, and they will both be speaking alongside two leading commentators who will no doubt prod and interrogate the ideas. Just to make it clear, because I know that people might be worried that this is a panel on which there are lots of men and I'm the token chair, I have no intention of being a token anything, and I'm not your normal chair. So I will be participating in this event, making my views clear and not remotely neutral, so no one's to moan. The format is that each panel will have 5 minutes each, and then we'll have a panel discussion up here at the top where there'll be something of an exchange of views, but then we have at least a full hour in which the audience can participate. And I'll be taking clusters of questions and points that will come back to and forth to the panel, but it's not a straightforward Q&A where the kind of experts and so on. It's more of a public conversation. We want to try and keep that fast-paced, and that would therefore indicate that it would be preferable that people didn't make speeches as though they were on the panel, but they kind of made quick points and we kind of got the conversation going properly. In terms of the issue that we've got before us, we'll all understand that the issue, particularly anything that's kind of centred on immigration, is very much of the moment and is causing some concern, some discussion, whether you're talking about Brexit or Trump, or the concern about the rise of seemingly right-wing populist movements throughout Europe. The issue of immigration is very much at the fore. That's often discussed in policy terms, in quite narrow economic terms, and that's, in my view, a rather technocratic way of understanding what's going on. And so you'll be aware that immigration has become very much played out in the present period within the framework of a kind of new culture wars, and is fought around in terms of quite moralistic and emotive kind of feelings on all sides. There's a rather kind of simplistic view of this, which is to say that there's a sort of, if you're right-wing, you're against immigration, if you're left-wing, you're for immigration. There's an awful lot of public shaming that goes on in relation to this discussion, which is not necessarily very helpful. I myself have always argued for freedom of movement as an ideal, as the cornerstone of an open liberal society, not just for people to seek refuge, but I think it's admirable that people might want to search out a better life and pursue their dreams and ambitions, even if it means moving far from their birthplace. But I'm also aware, as we all will be, that in 21st century Britain, Europe, America, that immigration is something of a troubling issue for many people. It discomforts people. It appears as a socially disorientating force. It looks as though it overturns customs, disturbs communities' way of life, and so on. It's often experienced as a profound threat to a way of life. And it raises all sorts of issues politically in those culture wars sense, in terms of the diversity agenda, the way identity politics plays out, a deepening and worrying polarisation. There's the whole challenge of demography, which in particular Eric is an expert at, and it just generally has kind of shaken things up a lot. I hope that this evening we can kind of leave behind the kind of partisan kind of ways of approaching this with kind of name calling and so on, and a kind of caricature of this issue. I like to quote from Konstantin Kisin, who's a Russian-British comedian who's a co-host of Trigonometry, which is an online film thing. He said, British people don't hate immigrants, they hate the politicians who keep claiming they do. And I think there's a lot in that. I think it's much more complicated than people make out. I think the issues have often been weaponized, and it means that there's a rather febrile atmosphere which we would rather avoid this evening. The way I hope it will go is that we have an intelligent conversation. So let me introduce the speakers in the order in which they'll speak. First of all, we're going to hear from Eric Kaufmann, who is Professor of Politics at Birkbeck College at the University of London. He works on cultural politics, ethnicity, national identity, and religion, and has a special interest in demography, and has written very interestingly on it. His books include Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? His latest book, which is one of the books which inspired this evening and is on sale at the end, is Whiteshift, Populism and the Future of White Majorities. And it's a much discussed book at the moment that explores how will white people respond to their share of population is steadily declining. Quite a tricky and interesting question. We'll then be hearing from Trevor Phillips. Trevor is a well-known, I'm sure you all know him, writer and broadcaster, former head of Equality and Human Rights Commission, spent much of his life working on thorny issues around this kind of area, has written and presented documentaries that caused some discussion and debate and raised questions that people were frightened to ask, one of them being things we won't say about race that are true, and also what British Muslims really think. And I think it's great to have Trevor here because he's very much an independent thinker, doesn't hold back, says what he thinks. We've then got David Aaronovitch, who's another troublemaker. He's a columnist for The Times. He's the presenter of Radio 4's The Briefing Room. He's the author of numerous books, including Voodoo Histories, The Role of Conspiracy Theory in Shaping Modern History. Actually, a book which I think has almost come into its own even more now, because if ever there was a time of conspiracy theories, I often think about things that you wrote in that, because it's very much of the moment. Anyway, and he's also the author of Party Animals, My Family and Other Communists. Until recently was a chair of Index on censorship and is a major advocate of free speech in this country. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Matthew Goodwin, who's Professor of Politics at Rutherford College, University of Kent. He works on the whole issue of populism in terms of British and European politics. He sat on the government's working group tackling anti-Muslim prejudice. He's the author of 6 books, including his latest book, which is everywhere at the moment, which is National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. It's hit a number of best-selling lists. He's, I believe, doing an audio book. It's being translated into Spanish, and it's only just out. So it's all obviously kind of really hit a nerve. And I made a point when he spoke at something recently that academia has become something of a place of orthodoxy in relation to issues such as Brexit, dare I mention it. And I've always found it refreshing that Matthew has at least tried to understand what happened with the Brexit vote, and he's inevitably been demonised as a consequence, but I think it's to his credit that he carried on trying to understand. But can we give them all a warm welcome, please? You will be aware that this debate has been something of a controversial issue before it even started, has been accused as a front for white supremacism and a variety of other kind of attempts at closing it down in some ways. I like to quote from an article by Kenan Malik in The Observer at the weekend from Joseph Joubert, an 18th century French essayist. It is better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it. And I think that's fair enough. I have absolutely full confidence in the fact that we will not settle anything this evening. But I think even raising these questions is important. Because of the febrile nature of politics today, and because the issues around race and immigration and ethnicity are so tricky, I'm aware of the fact that there will be sensitivities offended in the course of this evening, whether anyone intends to or not intentionally, but just in the nature of the debate. And I just urge us all to rise above, I mean, be offended, but not kind of storm out or say, I find that offensive in a way that closes everything down, but actually that we actually behave as the adults that we are and carry on and try and kind of learn from each other as well. I've been asked to tell you to turn off your phones, but I've also been asked to tell you that you're allowed to tweet. So don't turn off your phones, but do put them onto silent. Oh, I think that might be me. Anyway, it's making an odd sound. Anyway, right. Yes, so... And the hashtag is Conway Debate, hashtag Conway Debate. There's also free Wi-Fi that is available, apparently. So I hope this is going to be a constructive discussion, and I'm now going to ask Eric if he'll kick off this evening.
Thanks, Claire. Well, I just want to start actually with that controversy, because I think the original title is a good way to start my talk, which was, is rising ethnic diversity a threat to the West? Now, my view is that it's not a threat to the West. As a social scientist, I have quite a high bar for a threat that has to involve civil disorder and violence, and I think that's extremely rare in advanced industrial societies, particularly in consolidated democracies. And again, that's simply on the record of looking at these societies over a period of 50, 100 years. So those who make a claim about threat, I think often are manipulating fear rather than data and evidence, and succumbing to what Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff call catastrophizing, looking at worst case scenarios and suggesting that those are in some ways more common than they are. But just as I also would argue, by the way, that national populism is also not a threat to liberal democracy, and also white majority identity, a moderate version, is not a threat to minorities. So this goes for both left and right-wing causes, but yes, rising diversity, in my view, is not a threat to the West. However, the question about immigration as a challenge, I think, is correct, that immigration does pose a challenge to our societies. And I will argue that increasingly diverse societies are likely to experience reduced levels of social solidarity and rising value and political polarization. Again, this is not going to lead to any violence or any explosion. It's just that this is the trends that we see in the studies and the data. Which means there is a trade-off between solidarity and diversity, as David Goodhart noted. Somewhat similar, I guess, to that, the trade-off between individual liberty and social cohesion we see running through history. Now, some, including those who didn't want this talk to happen, believe that diversity on its own cannot be questioned, that it is a sacred value and you can never have too much of it. My view is not that. My view is that there is an optimum level of diversity in a society, and that this needs to balance, on the one hand, increases in diversity through immigration and reductions in diversity through assimilation. And we need to kind of find the right balance. It's not the case that more diversity is always better. Now, of course, it is true that diversity has benefits, and we know, I mean, there's a great experiment where people are asked to guess the number of beans in a jar, and if you take the average of 100 people's guesses, it comes close to the top guess out of those 100 people, and that's because people are bringing their diverse perspectives to bear. So yes, no doubt ethnic diversity does enhance that creativity of a society. But we have to balance that against some of the negatives which have been picked up in the literature and summarized, I think, by the American political scientist Robert Putnam, which suggests that ethnic diversity tends to have a negative effect on social solidarity. For example, if we compare, two prominent economists, William Easterly and Ross Levine, looked at economic development in Africa and East Asia. East Asia being very ethnically homogeneous, Africa being very ethnically diverse. And their argument was that between 25 and 40% of the difference in economic development between the two regions could be explained by different levels of ethnic diversity. In fact, moving from the most homogeneous to the least homogeneous country corresponded to a 2.5-fold drop in productivity. As they argue, high levels of ethnic diversity are strongly linked to high black market premiums, poor financial development, low provision of infrastructure, and low levels of education. Similarly, for developing countries, Alberto Alesina and his colleagues looking at American cities and counties found that ethnic diversity tended to predict lower spending on useful public goods such as education, garbage collection, and roads. In another study looking at the effect of government cutbacks in Uganda, researchers found that more ethnically homogeneous slums were able to organize their own policing in response to cutbacks and keep crime low. The ethnically diverse slums were not able to do so and experienced rising crime. And there's a lot of these studies that seem to show this trade-off between diversity and forms of solidarity. And Putnam argued that for Western societies, diversity would be associated with what he called hunkering down, people exhibiting lower trust, lower social connectedness and community, and pointed to this as a real problem. And Putnam, of course, as a Democrat, thought this was a real issue for the left that needed to be considered, again, in a balanced way. More recently, a couple of studies. One is a meta-analysis of the literature on diversity and solidarity in the US and Europe in 2014 by Tom Vandermeer and Joachim Tolsma that found, again, looking across the literature, that on balance, higher levels of local ethnic diversity was associated with lower levels of local solidarity, even when controlling for variables such as deprivation. And in this country, James Lawrence has done quite a pioneering study looking at, he tracks people really over 20 years in longitudinal data, and you can see how people whose neighborhoods grow more diverse in that period become less attached to those neighborhoods. So there is definitely, in my view, a well-established evidence base for higher diversity being associated with lower levels of solidarity. Now, will this definitely affect support for the welfare state? We certainly see this in the United States, but what about in Europe? I think in Europe, where, again, ethnic majorities tend to be employed and earn more money than ethnic minorities, we might expect to see pressure on the welfare state, whereas in countries where minorities and majorities earn similar amounts, like Canada and Australia, it's unlikely that this growing diversity would lead to pressure on the welfare state. However, I think in addition, we have a problem with value and political polarization. As I show in my book, in Western Europe, higher Muslim share and growth is associated with higher populist right vote share and greater political polarization. In the US, likewise, we have something similar in that the closer you get to the US-Mexico border, the greater the polarization over immigration. Again, that's associated with higher local county-level Hispanic population. And likewise, as Nolan McCarty and his colleagues show, there's a whopping 0.9 correlation between the proportion foreign-born in the United States and the level of polarization in the House of Representatives from 1879 to 2007. In final study I'm going to quote, shows that the Democrat and Republican voting bases, as they've become more racially distinct in the last 30 years, dislike of the opposing party or even hatred has increased. So just to conclude here, diversity is not a threat to the West, but it does have negative effects that we need to balance against its positive effects. And one of those negative effects is polarization, which can outweigh the positive economic effects. And until we see the large-scale ethnic and racial melting and mixing that we're going to see in the later part of this century, something I talk about in my book, immigration to the West will probably need to be slowed to allow more time for intermarriage and assimilation to catch up. Thanks.
Okay, lots of evidence and lots of data there, but also lots of things to argue against and interrogate later. So, good start. So, Trevor.
Well, thank you very, very much, Claire, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. I always like my credentials to be put out there so that I don't run into my normal experience. I've been president of the John Lewis Partnership for several years, and I went into my own store and chaps said, we're arguing about whether you're Trevor Phillips, the president, or whether you're Howard from the Halifax ad on TV. So I'm kind of, I always like to establish who I am. I'm going to approach this, I hope, from a point of view partly from evidence, certainly not at the level that Eric and Matthew can bring to the table, but experience here, experience latterly in the United States. I spend some of my life there now. I want to make one fundamental point. The question that we're being asked is not, should ethnic diversity be essentially a challenge for the West? The question is it? And I'm going to give my answer in a second. I am the son of immigrants. I was born here in London. But I'm not going to claim black privilege on this, because actually 3 of us, at least here, come from immigrant backgrounds of one kind or another. But I will say that the country that my family comes from, which when I was born was called British Guyana, is now called Guyana, has probably as much experience of this issue as any in the world. I think it's referred to in Eric's book, Whiteshift. Before most of us pitched up in Guyana, there was a small population of what we called Amerindians, First Nation people. Most people who live in Guyana today were brought there, slaves as indentured laborers and so on. There are 6 different ethnic groups in that small country, and there are less than 500,000 of us, or less than 750,000, beg your pardon, in a space the size of England and Wales. We have managed over my lifetime to generate enough ethnic conflict amongst the 700,000 of us to keep Guyana in the bottom 3 countries in the Western Hemisphere for poverty, because the conflict that we generate is such that there is no possibility of continuing political stability, so nobody will invest. Recently, we think we found oil, and of course there will be some people who will swoop. But I can tell you that ethnic diversity is not naturally a happy story of vibrant multiculturalism in which people learn to live with each other. Indeed, in the experience of my family, the longer we live with the people who are different to us, the more we dislike them. So I want to start from the premise that we shouldn't bring into this room a sort of view that says it should be like this. We need to deal, because this is such a serious topic, with what it is. And at a time where there are huge global threats, in order of importance to me, the changing technology, which is destroying jobs, changing cultures right across the globe, the domestic demography here, where by the time I get to David and I, similar age, by the time we get into our 80s, there'll be twice as many of us, depending on young people. That is going to change Western culture. Migration driven by massive population explosion in the Middle East and Africa. The UN estimates that today there are 400 million people living and working outside the country of their birth, more than at any time in human history. These are huge challenges. I am pro-immigration. I'm pro-immigration professionally. As a retailer, we depend on people from abroad. I chair a recruitment company. 1/5 of the people that we place as CEOs, CFOs, and so on, come from abroad. 1/3 of the people we place go to work abroad. There's been a double migration in my own family. We came here in 1950. My parents re-emigrated in 1967, remember Powell, to the United States, where we became immigrants again. This is the future of the Western world. And the other point, one point I want to make, which Eric, I think, briefly alluded to, is when we talk about ethnicity, what you have in your minds is me. What you have in mind is somebody who is dark. Let us remember that all kinds of groups have ethnicity. I can give you the legal definition. I spent 2 years crafting it for the Equality Act of 2010. But you who do not look like me are also ethnics. This is a question of affinity. It is a question of tribe. You have to spend just 1 week in the United States, or some parts of it, to understand that Donald Trump's appeal, which is still as strong as it was on the day he was elected, is tribal. People who know that steel tariffs will punish them will vote again for Donald Trump because he is their guy. He is the person with whom they identify. So the premise I want to put before you is we need to think about this not just as, oh, are there going to be strange coloured people upsetting white people? This is a much more interesting and significant and difficult topic than just that. Eric referred to the original title, Is Rising Ethnicity a Threat to the West? We now have a slightly more, I wouldn't be impolite as to say bland title, but perhaps slightly less, people would say, provocative title. I don't buy that, but my answer to both of these questions is yes. And actually my answer to the first title, Is Rising Ethnicity a Threat to the West? Is yes, and a good thing too. When my family the first person who was convicted under the Race Relations Act in 1968 was a man called Roy Saw. He was a Guyanese immigrant. He spoke every week at Speaker's Corner, and his opening salvo every Sunday was, I heard that England was going down the pan. I've come here to pull the chain. His point was, immigrants come here, obviously to change our lives, but we also want to change the country that we come to make it better. And I think that when we look at this question objectively, what we should remember is that immigration has changed our country. It has disrupted it. And in my view, mostly for the better. We should also remember this is not just a Eurocentric question. The people on the other side of this equation have views too. And many of them do not believe in liberal democracy. There are many people who are coming from different parts of the country who do not share the norms about the place of women, about family life. So there is challenge in our country. What may be disturbing us more is this. Not that liberal democracy as a sort of grand concept is under threat. It is that the architecture of conventional politics is being destroyed. Trump has done that in the United States. He has refashioned the Republican Party to be an ethnic, nationalist, white American party. And they're unashamed about that. They're unashamed about that. And it works because it reflects real cleavages in the United States society. And we need to understand in Europe that that is true here too. I can talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done, but I'll just make one last basic point. When we talk about this, let's try not to talk about those people as though they are ignorant bigots who, if only they were as clever and as civilized as us, they would understand that this is an absurd question. Let's remember that they may think about things in a very different way. Very simple point, for example. This country and the northeast of the United States are probably the only places in the world where religion is not staging a massive comeback, where people believe and their identity is being built around religion. Let's not think that the liberal consensus that we believe and hold on to is where the rest of the world is. It is a challenge to us, and we will not meet that challenge by simply saying, grow out of it, get civilized like us, and then we can all be together. Other people believe something very different, and if we don't understand that that is a challenge to us, that is where we will sink under the waves as they're beginning to do in continental Europe. Thank you.
Thanks. Fascinating, and some real things to think about there that kind of completely go against the grain of the way this discussion is usually had. So that was very helpful. Thanks, Trevor. David.
Thanks, Claire. As both previous speakers have referred to, the original title for this event, which caused what I think the Germans call ein großer shitstorm, is rising ethnic diversity a threat to the West? To which the answer has to be, well, not judging by this room. But But let's talk about first, I think, what we may be able to agree about. I mean, part of the reason why we're having this discussion is because we live in the era of Trump, Brexit, Viktor Orban, and so on. And the great discussion has gone on everywhere and between everybody, and everybody appears to have a theory about it, and everybody's theory is right about why it is that a significant group of people have gone off to do the kind of things that they have. Now, the thing that I think we agree about here is that the main motivation of those predominantly white, male, older and less well-educated people to support what we might call the new populism, you can call it other things if you like, is not primarily economic. That's one of the things that we can generate. Now, this is not a consensus because a lot of people want it very much to be so, because if it is primarily economic, then you can solve it with economics, and that would make life much easier for us. But we, on the whole, tend to agree that the evidence doesn't tell us that story. But that doesn't mean that we have to subscribe entirely to the strand of thinking that seems to identify the populist problem as lying almost entirely in the area of encountering other people who are not quite like you, or to agree with the proposition that the more they're not quite like you on a sliding scale, the more you are likely to dislike it and the society that you're within. Eric's figures about Uganda notwithstanding. What I think we see is rather a combination of resentments and identifications, positive identifications, sometimes barely coate, often nostalgic about what has been lost or is about to be lost. Now, some of these fuse together in what you might call ethno-nationalism, and the most obvious object of the resentment is people who may seem different or threatening, who seem in some way or other to express the alteration of the world around you. Or as a fish and chip shop owner near Wakefield put it to me after the referendum when I went up there for a BBC programme, he said, "I don't go into the city centre anymore because no one speaks English." I'd been in Wakefield city centre for a large part of the previous day and had encountered nearly nobody who didn't speak English. Now, the point is clearly not whether he's wrong or he's right about it. The fact is that this is what he felt about it. Now, on one level, and he was motivated partially to vote on this basis. Now, at one level, this has always been true. Eric's book establishes this very, very well. Amongst particular, and what Trevor says is also true, the Guyana is a very interesting case of what colonial administrations leave behind them sometimes, in terms of how it was that your forebears got there, and how, I mean, as a person from a communist family, one of the things I knew the difference between was Forbes Burnham, who was essentially your guy, and Cheddi Jagan, who was essentially the Indians guy, the other side, etc. And there was a complete Cold War division between them, which also operated down the ethnic split, and was very interesting. But in one level, this has always been true, and particularly for what you might call white majority communities, or actually majority communities full stop, because people respond to the incoming of various peoples. It was true of Enoch Powell's speech in 1968 and the response to it. And also, one of the things that Eric reminded me of in his book was how Thatcher's speech, Mrs. Thatcher's television interview in 1978, identified this thing almost precisely. She said, essentially, people will feel rather swamped if too many people of a different culture, and she mentioned people from the new Commonwealth, i.e. dark people, come in too quickly. It was absolutely, I mean, it was not totally explicit, but it was pretty clear what she was talking about. We can take in more white people, but it's a bit tricky if you ask us to take in too many black people too quickly. That's swamping and people won't like it. They'll react badly, and that, you know, best not to let it happen. But there is also a misdirection here, I think, in making this, if you like, an almost kind of monocausal subject of a monocausal reason for the phenomenon we see around us. And And I say it's a misdirection because the factors that actually have impacted most on traditional lifestyles have, in fact, if you think about it, precious little to do with ethnicity or diversity. They just don't. Unless you consider your gay son or daughter to be an aspect of diversity, in which case it's your bloody diversity. I mean, it's come from you. Think of the loss of heavy manual work, the loss of male status, the decline of deference in society, not just to men in those situations, but by them to other people, a deference that used to exist. The atomization of community lifestyles. To give you an example, we're closing down pubs everywhere. What are the pubs being replaced by? Netflix. Well, immigrants didn't do that to us. That wasn't a product of immigration. But one of the things it most definitely has helped to do is to atomize communities that might previously have had meeting places or more meeting places whereby people would commune with each other. They feel badgered by the welfare states and do-gooders not to smoke, not to eat stuff, not to pollute. Some, like Claire Fox, manage to resist this badgering, others don't. And then there's the whole business of being alive and ill and needing the NHS, as opposed to being, as they would have been in the past, dead. And that's not a joke, that's true. One of the most enormous changes to people's lifestyles is the fact that they have lifestyle after the age of 65 and 70 where they didn't previously. It's a huge change. In other words, what I'm talking about is massive social changes which have had precisely nothing to do either with ethnicity or with migration. Divorce rates, sexual diversity and so on. Now, another reason why I have a problem, particularly with the way in which Eric has developed his thesis, is the problem of deciding whether we are actually talking about colour or not. There's a reason why Eric's book is called Whiteshift. Essentially, Whiteshift is what he describes as the gradual diminution, or what he actually uses the word decline of white populations and so on. There's a problem with the use of the word decline. I mean, it may not be a problem in political sciences terms, but it is a huge problem in everybody else's terms, which is decline is bad for most people. And yet, for the white majority population to decline, all that has to happen is that your son and daughter go out and marry a person not of the same race and they have children. It is very hard to use the word decline about actual people and so on. And when we talk, therefore, about colour and the problem that those create, as opposed to, let's say, kind of more amorphous cultural differences, you are locating very precisely what you mean by decline in the person of somebody of that particular colour. There's no way around it. I mean, if there's no significant racial component, then otherwise why would you use the word white? Why bother? You wouldn't do it. You would just say British majority or something like that. One of the things that's very interesting is when people talk about London Britons forming a minority in their own capital, when what they mean is white Britons. I'm going to say very quickly, and I'll come on to the rest of this later because I've just been told that I've only got 1 minute. I don't think that there is a legitimate white majority interest that can be expressed practically without detriment to the rights of minorities. And when we come on to discuss this, we'll look at precisely that. And that's actually why there was a grosser shitstorm, to a certain extent, about the original title of this meeting. Because for some people, it actually meant them. And it meant people around them or people that they knew. And I want to come on to that. And the second point I want to make a bit later is that in any case, all these things, negative though they may be, are neither immutable or eternal. They actually do change. They have actually changed in our lifetime significantly since the period of Enoch Powell's speech, or even since the period of Margaret Thatcher's speech of 1978. And the question that I would like to ask, and we leave hanging there, is how do we best change them, not how do we best worry about the threat of diversity to the West.
Thank you. Indeed, those last two questions are exactly the kind of questions I want to come back to in the discussion before we go out to everyone, because I think they are the key issues here this evening. But anyway, to finish off this formal part, Matthew.
Great, thank you. So my answer to the question, is immigration and diversity politics a challenge, is yes. I go a little further. I think that it's going to be a much bigger challenge than we currently appreciate even today, and that it's going to be with us as a challenge beyond our lifetimes. It's going to, I think, accelerate over a very, very long period of time. But secondly, I think today a lot of people, particularly on the left of the political spectrum, are actually misdiagnosing what's happening, which is partly making the current challenge a lot worse, a lot more difficult than perhaps it might otherwise be. So why is it a challenge? I think firstly, I wanted to talk a bit about Europe, in that it's quite clear that public anxiety over migration and more generally ethnic change is fundamentally central to the political fragmentation and volatility that we're seeing today. The question that lots of financial analysts often ask is, when you look at Brexit and Trump and these national populist movements, do they signal that we are leaving a period of political churn and disruption, or do they instead signal that we are entering into a new period of great disruption and change? And I would certainly support the latter view. The reason I think people ask it that way is because it gets into debates that are basically about generational change. And if you are on the left or you read The Economist, you are probably won over by arguments that this is all about angry old white men who are about to die and be replaced by the newly ascendant, ethnically, culturally diverse, university-educated majorities. If you want a classic example of that, you could read Stan Greenberg's book, America Ascendant. Stan Greenberg assured me in 2015 that the Democrats would control the White House for the next 20 to 30 years because demography equals liberal destiny. The problem with that basic thesis is that it's easy to demolish by looking at the evidence of what is actually going on. And if you look at Europe at the moment, one of the things that I find particularly striking is actually the pace of political change. And I think when you're living amid political change that is so profound, in a way you lose sight of how important that change is, which sounds odd, but if you'd said to me 10 years ago that we'd have the government that we have in Italy, we'd have the alternative for Germany in every one of Germany's state parliaments, over 90 seats in the Bundestag, that Britain would have voted for Brexit, that Sweden Democrats would have 18%, that the Austrian National Populists would be back in government, that Central and Eastern Europe would largely be dominated by national populists, particularly Poland and Hungary. I wouldn't have believed you, as somebody that works on populism and the right. I wouldn't have believed you. I would have said that you're exaggerating the change. We've had human civilization as we'd recognize it for what, about 5,000 years. We've had liberal democracy in Western Europe, the US, for what, about 100 years. We forget how young our democracies are. We forget how quick political change and radical changes can happen. And at the heart of that change is public concern over immigration and ethnic change. The biggest myth that many on the left subscribe to and continue to subscribe to and refuse to let go is the old Marxist trope that this is about economic competition. And if you continue to believe that, then I'm afraid you will continue to be outflanked, as social democracy is across much of Europe. When you have parties like the German SPD on 15%, and you have social democracy being torn apart as middle-class liberals go over to Greens and radical left parties, and workers basically go into apathy or go over to national populists, the question becomes not can social democracy revive itself, but actually can social democracy survive? And that's the question that's facing the centre-left. And again, immigration and ethnic change are very much at the heart of that process. Not wholly, as David said, and I do agree with him, that economics has a role to play, but it is a very secondary role. The other myth that a lot of people have bought into is the idea that all of this churn and change is being driven by white voters in areas where they've had no experience with ethnic diversity. And this was really popular after Brexit and Trump, because basically people like to say, oh, the bigots and the idiots have never experienced this change. I can point you to a number of studies, all of which tell a very consistent picture that in the US and the UK, support for Leave, support for Trump was strongest by some way in counties or local authorities that had experienced dramatic demographic change over a short period of time. And that change we will see a lot more of in the coming years. And so what I would argue is actually this debate that we're having about open versus closed is incredibly unhelpful, because it completely glosses the fact that people are more focused on this issue of pace, the pace of change, and the extent to which we can manage change while also ensuring that our communities are integrated and cohesive. There's a reason why the left in Denmark are now giving support to a very radical cohesion policy platform, which is going to see, for example, kids under 10 only be able to go to schools that have mixed classrooms where they will meet people from other backgrounds. There's a reason why the Swedish Social Democrats have changed their position quite radically, and why some on the left in Germany are doing the same, which is that, in my view, thankfully, people are actually waking up to the fact that we're going to have to think a hell of a lot harder, not just about making the case for why this change is partly inevitable, but we're going to have to work a hell of a lot harder at how it's managed locally and how we build some of that cohesion. And I think, lastly, what's interesting to me at least is, and I would agree with Eric, that the big challenge particularly is that we know from the evidence that as we experience more ethnic diversity in the future, the big risk is that trust is going to decline and people are going to withdraw their support for the welfare state. And this is particularly pressing for people on the left that want to have lots of economic solidarity, although, to be frank, lots of my new friends on the left are more interested in identity politics and economic solidarity these days, which I think is another problem that we have to deal with. But that's going to be the trade-off. If you're going to make the passionate case for open borders, for example, which lots of people like to make, then you're going to have to accept that a consequence of that may be that people start to withdraw their support for collective goods. Are you an optimist? If you're an optimist, then you think that actually as our societies become more diverse, we're all going to have more contact with one another, and that's going to reduce prejudice and turn the world into a happy, lovely place. I don't see a lot of evidence for that. I see a lot of evidence for something else. When Gordon Allport argued that contact is what would ultimately get us through moments like this, he argued that people experiencing contact have to experience it under what he called optimal conditions. They have to be working towards a collective outcome. They have to have a facilitated environment, like tonight, for example. They have to have mutual respect and various other things. What I see across much of Europe and the US is something very different, which is fleeting contact. People are really exchanging and meeting one another at work, or they're having very short, low-quality forms of contact. And that actually has been shown to make things much worse. It leads to a deterioration of attitudes, and is going to be a real challenge going forward. And just finally, diversity politics is on the slide, and I think that's a really important point that we have to get to grips with, which is that, unfortunately, as Mark Liller in the US, Fukuyama, John Haidt, and many others have talked about, and if I can recommend one report to you, I would recommend the Hidden Tribes report by More in Common, who show this very nicely. There are 2 or 3 strains now within what you would loosely call the liberal left, the social democratic left. And one of those strains today, which happens to be the loudest, is the progressive activist left, which engages endlessly in this obsession with white privilege, with historical grievances, which has been shown to be less interested in compromise, less interested in consensus, more interested in defining everybody as a victim, not interested in actually discussing what brings us together as a community, more angry than other groups, more narcissistic, I would add on to that list from other research. And the real challenge, if we're going to navigate this period of polarization, is not just how we deal with the actual effects of migration and ethnic diversity, but actually how we do what we're doing tonight, which is try and prop up the moderate middle marketplace of ideas, that center ground where we can at least deliberate and discuss without fanatics trying to shut us down and try and describe us as being complicit in violence and all the rest of it. So I think we really do have a massive challenge on our hands, and it will start with us and it will carry on long after we're gone. But yes, I think that immigration and diversity politics is a challenge.
Okay. I was with you all the way until you said that we should all aspire to the moderate middle. I do not want to end up in the moderate middle. You can go over there and do that. I think that we've had some fantastically interesting things. So I'm actually going to start with you, Trevor, because you were just actually saying you've done some work on some of the things which Matt was saying, and I think it'll help me kind of move in, which is... Yeah, go on, you just say...
Well, I'll be brief with this. One of the points that Matt made, I think we really have to get around our heads. When we think about people's reaction to immigrants and immigration, there's an illusion that takes place in politics, which is the more you have, the more tricky it is, the more problematic it is. Actually, almost everything that we now know says that's not true. What actually creates, if you like, unsettlement, tranquility, loss of social peace is pace of change. We did a nice piece of work, I say we did a nice piece of work, somebody else did a nice piece of work for me, which looked at a South London borough, for those of you who know, that's Bexley, and one of the things that they did was compare it with Croydon. And one aspect of the work was to look at where the UKIP vote appeared, and let's take UKIP as a proxy for this anxiety. The place where the UKIP vote appeared was not in Croydon, where the non-white population somewhere north of 35%. Where it appeared most rapidly and actively was in Bexley, where the total non-white population something like 19%. But the important thing is it appeared in wards where the increase in diversity had been most rapid. The variable that really affects this question is pace of change, not numbers, which is why you get this idea that in London we're all fine, relaxed, though actually all the data on London tells us, by the way, we do not mix across the lines of race in London. But the point about London is there's not a massive change across the city. Can I just make one other...
Very quick.
Quick point. I agree with what Matthew said about that we have to try to think about how we deal with this. And I think it is extremely important to deal with the reality rather than what we want it to be. The one thing I think I disagreed with what David said about is this the attack on the word decline. The truth of the matter is, for white populations, there is a decline. Let us remember, and I'm going to put this as brutally as I can, that most of the history of my encounter with you is one of white privilege. That is the history of it. And you know that as well as I know it. Now, the demography and the advance of civil rights and equality means that the easy assumption of that privilege no longer obtains. The very first television program I ever made was about the sanitation workers in South London. At that time, jobs were passed on from father to son to nephew. There was 100% certainty if you were on the dust, you were white. There was no possibility. Now, Law has changed that. Culture has changed that. And from me, my point of view, it's all plus. But for the person at the other end, that is the end of white privilege. And I'm not sympathetic to them, but let's understand, when you talk about decline, for that person, for the person whose father and grandfather had the assumption that he would work in that job, it is a story of decline. And I think we have to be honest with people that that is where we are heading. We can't just say it doesn't exist, because for those people, it does, and it is real. And it's right, but it's also real.
Okay, I want to throw out a question to you all, which is related somewhat to that, which is, one of the things that I think is extraordinary is about the values question, but I'm genuinely torn about this, right? Because the latter points we're talking about pace of change, and yet in some ways there seems to be an appetite for change, because the one thing that we haven't got at the moment is the status quo. I mean, people are basically saying the status quo, throw everything up in the air, we don't care. We're kind of prepared to go with that. But one of the things which I think is there's a confusion in terms of immigration is an assault on values, which do appear to be an assault on people's values. And the reason I'm saying that is because immigration, when I was saying it's been weaponized, one of the things that's happened over recent years surely has been this idea that immigration can somehow be used to make any country better, and often is used to assault the values of kind of the old. You know what I mean? We can have this wonderful new immigrant group of people who are, you know, it's kind of like the white, lazy working class. You can't get them to do anything, so we've got to get new people in. As it happens, it's not, I don't think it's actually to do with skin colour often, because it might well be earlier immigrants, but it's kind of this idea we can refresh everything. Look at the way that anti-racism is used to police people's language, everything they think. Have you got the right attitudes? You know, that's one of the things that's come out in relation to the Brexit issue, which is you've got the wrong attitudes. You need to go on a re-education course. You know, so it's the sense in which people think, I don't want this to change, is because it's things they might believe in, but it's not necessarily as it used to be. In terms of immigration was used to kind of come in, and there was an economic argument about jobs and, you know, build the economic infrastructure of this country. Whereas now it's almost like a kind of moral infrastructural growth. There's a kind of completely different way that this is discussed. If you are a modern, cosmopolitan, open person who likes and loves immigration and immigrants, then you are good and happy, you know, and you can join the club. If you are slightly anxious that somebody tells you that your views are completely outdated and wrong, and, you know, you can't have anything to do with that, I don't think it's just jobs, is what I'm saying, in terms of the dustmen, as you indicated, but I think that that was a good illustration. I think it's more than that. It's more profound and more cultural. But anyway, what does anyone think? David, I'm going to come to you, then I'm going to come to Eric.
Do you know, I'm sorry, Claire, I've rather lost track of what the question was.
Sorry. It's not, I'm trying to say that
She's making the argument.
I'm making an argument, it's cultural. Don't worry, you can say what you want, don't worry.
A set of norms and values.
Yeah, norms and values. I'm saying but fair enough, say what you want.
Okay, there are two elements to that. The first is to say that norms that people have held are being destroyed by everybody all the time. So, most of us who have children who go to universities in the last few years have been told that things that we have been used to be saying and expressions we've been used to using, maybe we should think about not using or saying them, and it becomes tiresome after a while. And yet it's amazing the degree to which you manage to accommodate them quite happily after a while, and you then move on. And I think, you know, there's an argument for saying it was ever like that. In one way, this feels like the kind of old argument about political correctness and so on. And so, there are things that irritate me, like I do not believe in a problem of cultural appropriation, because I'm a big believer in human syncretism. In other words, people take the best ideas from each other that they like and the most attractive and mash them up. That's what we see all the time. And for people to be too aggressively and zealously and sanctimoniously policing other people's language about that is irritating. But I understand that it's a way of them bigging themselves up, and maybe I can cope with it, but maybe other people have a difficulty. But the thing that I return to, and the point that no one else has taken up here, is, and I return to it, the most significant changes that people have had which have messed up their lives or changed their lives or altered their circumstances have had bugger all to do with immigration. And yet here we are discussing it as if it's the only thing that ever happened to people. So one of the questions is, why? Now, in Eric's book, there are some interesting questions. He talks about the impacts upon communities of diversity, and it's actually quite difficult to get in amongst the weeds somewhere, which kind of take that on trust. But he also talks about how immigration becomes a particular problem, or race becomes a particular problem, when it rises in salience. And he actually does, at one point, identify salience as being essentially when people who have big voices and in the political firmament help to try and make this a big issue for the various reasons that they have. And that is, and let's be absolutely frank about it, that's one of the things that worries me about populism. I have no doubt that the dislike or distrust or fear of the other is a fairly kind of constant presence in human society, less now possibly than it was, partially because we thought we'd learned the lessons of various genocides, etc., and where that actually went. But no one's been under any doubt that it could, to use your word, which I think maybe we should be the last time we use it tonight, weaponized. What certainly dislike of the other is one of the most weaponizable commodities on the face of the earth, and we all know it, which is one of the reasons why people may be overzealous in their attempts to stop what they think is a weaponizing, and they definitely are. And they can act as freezers on debate, as they try to do in this instance, and that is wrong. But that is only one smaller problem in what I think are a list of much greater problems. Who's the greatest threat to freedom of speech? You know, some idiot in a university who wants to shout at Julie Bindel or Viktor Orban? Well, I don't really have very much doubt about what that is.
As it happens, I was also trying to address your question, obviously badly, because I do think that people aren't anti-immigrant, but immigration has become a very big question. And I just don't think it's because populists have said it. And I was trying to explain how I think it's become an issue. But anyway, that was my attempt, badly. Eric?
Yeah, I mean, let me pick that up first of all, because in a way the implication of what David was suggesting was that salience was a sort of supply-side issue, that when you have a political entrepreneur that bangs the drum, automatically you're going to get an increase in salience. And in fact, what we see, and what I argue in the book, and actually Bobby Duffy at Ipsos Mori and his colleagues have shown this, is that as the net migration number in Britain and 9 out of 10 European countries, James Dennison and his colleagues at the European University Institute show, as that number of net migrants increases, the salience rises along with it, right? So in a way, it's hard to explain that correlation as simply a matter of political supply. I would explain it more in terms of a response to that diversity. Now, it's important to note that opposition to immigration didn't rise as immigration rose. But the people who were already opposed to immigration, which is typically a majority in many European countries, within that group, immigration rose from, say, number 5, 6 issue behind healthcare and the economy to number 1. And that, on the back of that, is where you get the populist right. So it's rising salience, but I would argue it's more of a demand side effect and cannot be so easily manufactured by political entrepreneurs.
Eric, I'm sure you do, but there are several instances in your book where essentially the salience is explained by what political forces and journalistic forces are doing at the time. They're in there, I can send them to you and so on, and I'm not saying they're the whole explanation. And by the way, in this discussion, let's not impute to each other terms we don't use. I never use the word automatic. I don't believe in automaticity. I'm not a clunk-click determinist. They haven't managed to make it onto the platform tonight.
Okay. I didn't use political correctness either, by the way, because I was trying to not do that. But anyway, Matthew, just anything that you think, I suppose for me it's kind of that pace of change thing versus the values clash. Is it just a pace of change issue, or is there something more going on? I can't get my head around that.
Well, I think we all know that values are now having a much bigger influence on how we vote than other traditional indicators. You know, if you look at Britain right now, values are having a really big influence on how we're navigating Brexit and elections, far more so than traditional things like social class. And I think the issue about the value conflict for me is that this has been an incredibly long time coming, that effectively values don't really change that much. I mean, there are a few things that, if you go to university, you self-select into university, you're a bit more likely to become a bit more liberal, a bit more internationalist, and generally speaking, we all become a little bit more conservative as we age. This is usually the bit where my students aggressively protest against that, but I think James Tilley at the University of Oxford has shown that the average person becomes 0.35% more conservative as every year of their life rolls on. So I think it doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually explains the generational differences that we see in support for Labour and the Conservatives. But the value conflict has been a long time coming, and it will stay in place. And I think one of the most interesting books I've read recently was Karen Stenner's work. Well, actually, it was about the time Donald Trump was elected, where thankfully Karen Stenner began to get a lot of attention. She's a psychologist that really was under the radar. She wrote a really good book called The Authoritarian Dynamic, wasn't it? Yeah. And Stenner's argument was that effectively in every society there's a significant section that is predisposed to value stability, conformity, that is more likely to feel threatened, under threat from rapid changes around them. And the most important change actually relates, to go back to David's point, it's not just about the collapse of deference, it's not just about the changing social norms, but we are wired to feel particularly under threat from changes that relate to our tribe, ethnicity, and community. And Stenner's argument, which I think has been validated by the events of not just the last 2 years, but the last 30, is that when people feel that sense of threat, which is a common used word in the academic literature, one group in particular will backlash against that threat, and they will mobilize politically. And I think that's largely what we've seen in response to the demographic changes that, to be blunt, have only, as I mentioned earlier, have only just begun across Europe. US is slightly different, obviously, because of its much richer tradition. So in response to your question, the value conflict, not necessarily between open and closed, but between these groups, more sort of socially liberal end and a more a sort of threat-prone end with a big lump in the middle, a sort of hesitant middle, or what others have called the sort of exhausted majority that are still making up their minds, which is a crucial point. We're not fixed. We will all change our minds as we go through the change. That value conflict is going to basically be with us for a while.
Okay, sorry. Right, everyone's now going to speed up a bit, but you're going to come in quickly, and then you're going to...
I just want to... people responded very positively to something that David said, which puzzled me. David and I have been on platforms with each other for 45 years, and he has never failed to convince me, but tonight might be a difference. When you say that immigration is not the thing that has created the most change for people, how do you know? I mean, if you go to Boston and Lincolnshire, that is what they think, and they will tell you the story, and you can actually see it actually in the town square. The things that matter to us, I want to make just 2 quick points about this. When you say it hasn't made the biggest difference, you are making some assumption about what difference is big for other people. Now, the things that may make a big difference to them might not be wages or housing. It might be something completely different. So I think, first of all, let's just be a bit humble about it. I think some people do believe it's different, and we have to argue that out. There's a struggle. The other thing I want to point out, just want to make is this. There are things, this is a more subtle equation. There are real differences which may become racially coded. In the United States, probably the thing that tipped Trump over into victory in autumn 2016 was the fact that the Affordable Care Act bills started landing in doormats at the end of September. In short, the Affordable Care Act, which benefits all sorts of people, black, white, and so on, became code in the United States for redistribution of benefits from white districts to inner city districts. And that is true, but it became racially coded and read as a racial redistribution. And that actually is also true. That wasn't the purpose, but that's what happened. Something similar, potentially, will happen in this city in relation to knife crime. Knife crime is not happening because of people's skin color, but if you look at who perpetrators and victims are, it is objectively unarguable that 90% look like me. Last sentence. Knife crime is already changing people's behavior in this city. And it would be fatuous for us to sit here and say, in people's minds, it's never going to be racially coded. My point here is this is not good or bad. This is, and part of what is a responsible answer to this is to think, how do we deal with that fact rather than telling people they shouldn't think this way? They do.
Okay, Eric, very quick. I'm going to go. I'm going to get Eric to come in, and then I'm going to come out to the audience. So if the people with the microphones could make themselves more visible to me, because it's terrible lighting.
Just very quick way to connect your question about values. Matt's just mentioned Karen Stenner's idea, but that there are essentially more conservative and more sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. More conservative and more liberal parts of the population, and that this is somewhat due to innate psychology and heredity, right? So what you get is you get immigration and ethnic change, and you get these two parts of the population, one part that likes change and diversity, the one part that likes stability and order, responding in different ways. So that's one source of polarization. But then, on top of that, we're getting people saying, okay, we oppose immigration, we don't oppose immigration. The second question is it morally okay to oppose immigration? It's not the same question. And there you see a second polarization between the groups that says, no, you're awful if you oppose immigration, and the other group that feels put upon because they've been told they're a racist. And we see this at just last bit of data I'm going to throw at you. In the US, for example, the question, is it racist for a white American to want less immigration so that their share of the population doesn't decline? White Clinton voters, it's like 75%. White Trump voters, it's about 10%. So it's a huge value divide layered on top of a divide over this response to immigration, which is making this polarization so acute.